It's always a great pleasure for African Ascent to interact with my committed and devoted viewers every other week. I wish I could manage my time somewhat differently so that I can interact with my viewers every single day. There might come a time in which African Ascent might be able to do that. For now, it's something that happens every other week. And so far, African Ascent, thanks to the generous contributions of the stellar faculty, which consists of musicians, artists of all stripes, professors, so forth and so on, that Berklee College of Music is conspicuously known for. African Ascent proudly brings you Professor Anthony Sibilia for the first time. And I'm sure once we break the ice, Professor Sibilia is bound to become a regular contributor to African Ascent, contingent on the possibilities of how effectively he could manage his time. He happens to be so busy. Professor Sibilia is a trained art historian, a noted photographer, a classical pianist. He combines all three into an impressive single aesthetic whole. And tonight, by way of introducing him to my audience, we'll carve out a dimension of his complex practices and focus on photography and art history. He is formally trained at Cornell University, in which he received his BA, which led him to go to graduate school, and he managed to get 2 degrees, an MA and a PhilMA, I think it's called, from the world-famous Columbia University. African Ascent is truly proud to bring you Professor Anthony Sibilia from Berklee College of Music for the first time. Welcome to African Ascent.
Thanks for having me.
What a pleasure. So perhaps before we begin getting into discussing your mesmerizing pictures, photographs, some of which I'm fortunate to view and see every day because I and you happen to be office mates at Berklee College of Music, I thought that we would begin conversing about the nature of photography itself. This is not to say that your interests are varied, because as I said in the introduction, you combine into one impressive whole 3 talents, photography, art history, and architectural design. So why don't we talk about how is it that you decided to become a photographer? I've always admired photographers, but up until now, I don't even know how to take a single picture.
Right.
I distort them and I mess them up.
Well, I actually started taking pictures with a sort of maybe more focused or serious intent when I was at Cornell University as an undergraduate. And it was about now 1992, I guess, when I was there, and I was finishing up my studies. And I was doing a project that actually dealt with the acoustics of Gothic and Romanesque churches in France. And it was a very interdisciplinary study. It was about how polyphony, a new kind of music that used many voices, was being written for places like Notre Dame of Paris in the Gothic period. This is the 12th and 13th centuries. And it was a big shift musically from what had come before. And so I was interested in seeing if there was anything about the architecture and the music that were sort of talking to each other. And so one of the things that I had to do as part of this project was to document it somehow. So I had a friend, he was a graduate student at the time at Cornell, and he happened to be very good with a camera. And he said, well, when we're going this summer, would you like me to show you a little bit about how to do this? And I said, sure. And so we went to the church at Cornell, and he started to show me, and I figured out which equipment I needed. So it was sort of by a fluke in a way. I just wanted to illustrate my thesis. I was doing an undergrad thesis.
Do you remember the very first picture that you took? And if so, how old were you then? Can you recall that far back?
Very first picture, yeah. Actually, it's funny because I was going through some old pictures recently, and I noticed that from the time I was quite young, I would put pictures into albums. I would collect them in some form. I had gone to Europe with a cousin when I was around 19, and I made that into an album, and I organized it by the different countries I went to. But the very first one I did was when I was about 10. And my parents and I went to Vienna, Austria, and Munich, Germany, and it made a huge impression on me. But the first photo I consciously remember taking was probably around that time. I probably took pictures before that, but I really remember taking this picture. And when I look back on it, I was laughing because it was a picture of my parents. They're standing together, arm in arm, and there's a big airplane behind them. And I noticed that the way I framed it, I didn't just aim at them. I sort of made it so that the airplane was part of the composition. And I guess the reason it makes me laugh is because later on I ended up shooting a lot of architecture. My interest is so much in space because a lot of photographers, they might just shoot pictures of people, human subjects all the time, right on the subject. Whereas for me, I had my parents there, but I was sort of interested in how they were working within a larger space. So
that's remarkable.
Yeah.
This takes me by way of belaboring the point, and
Yeah.
it's a genuine interest of mine. I was impressed by these pictures that you did, which were displayed on 7 Haviland Street.
Yeah.
And then I was recently, while I was preparing for this interview, very carefully looking at some of these pictures, because my training in philosophy is aesthetics. That's what I did my PhD on. And so I haven't exactly forgotten what it is that I must look at when I'm looking at a particular picture, because I did study Gauguin and Van Gogh, particularly the shoes, the chair, and the bedroom, the 3 pieces in particular, as philosophical works, philosophically comported artworks. And so I tried to bring some of that knowledge, some of that experience, and then I was looking at some of these photographs of yours. What impressed me is, if I may say, your obsession with interiors, with space, particularly dark corners, stairs, curtains, floors, ceilings, and then capturing them in such a way that it invites the viewer to meditate about what he or she is looking at, either through fragments of memory, through remembrance, through events that have happened in one's life, or spaces that the viewer has been into, which he took as common place events, and then you see them in your work with an aesthetic dignity, photographed and presented to the viewer in a very enticing way. That is a summary, perhaps a distortion of what I'm thinking I'm looking at. So I would like us to talk about this space.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, right away what you're saying makes a lot of sense. I think that in one frame of reference, sometimes the way we think, again, maybe it goes back to the idea of human actors versus just a space. And what is a space? You know, in other words, space it's always there, but sometimes it could be treated almost like a second-hand quality or a backdrop, where maybe the actors are more important, right? But another way to look at space is to just say, well, what is inherently there? Like you said, the floors, the ceilings, these are surfaces, right? These are just very basic, they're elemental aspects of absolutely everything that surrounds us, right?
That's right.
Space it's ubiquitous, right?
Exactly.
And the everydayness that you pointed out as well, there's something about it. To me, it has started more and more to feel almost like a meditative process, taking pictures, that because, you know, if anyone has ever practiced meditation, you know, you're not really aiming for anything in particular. You're not trying to say this is spectacular or special necessarily, but you're just aware of what's actually happening around you. You're receptive to what's happening around you. And so space is beautiful that way because it's just sort of, it's always presenting itself, right?
It's remarkable. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, what makes your work particular, of singular interest to me, is the philosophy. Is that because you're also a professional philosopher and you have brought a philosophical understanding of space, of time, temporality, perspectives, horizons, so forth and so on, all these themes that philosophy has engaged itself for millennia into the photography. Is that why when I'm strolling on 7 Haviland Street, I am encouraged to look at what I am looking at meditatively, to use your term, and not simply look at it thinking that I'm looking at something that the photographer happened to have just simply photographed. Because the photographs glue me, and I do this every other day when I walk on that corridor. I use them as thinking moments, because I'm also attracted to darkness.
Yeah.
And in your hands, you make darkness beautiful, because we're so accustomed to thinking that beauty is light. But in your work, darkness itself, not seeing, which is a kind of seeing, becomes a beautiful exercise. You make blackness beautiful.
Yeah, and I think since I've had 2 shows at Berkeley, right? There was the earlier show and the one that's up now, which has the Amsterdam photos. I perceived in my own work a shift. The earlier show had a lot of very dark images, and maybe we'll have a chance to look at some of those.
I hope we do.
Yeah, some of those darker images where it was just something was starting to emerge from the darkness, but it was mainly a darkness. That was what I was feeling. And then with the Amsterdam pictures, there's a lot of openings, doorways, windows, light by comparison with the last set. There was a kind of flooding in of light, but shadow and light still play a central role in all of them, right? And that's always been a theme that's run through my work. But in respect to your question, I guess it's interesting because even though I've studied so much art history and so many philosophies of art, there is something that when I'm asked to talk about my pictures, like recently they were featured somewhere and the person said, could you write something for it? And I thought, wow, you know, honestly, it sounds kind of simple-minded, but I'm taking pictures of things that I just love. I go to a space with an instinct that I would like to shoot that space, and I go in and people often ask me if I plan the shots, and I don't. I mean, I just walk into the space and I'm looking. It's a feeling you have that you look at something and it attracts you, it catches your eye. I set up the camera and I shoot the picture. That's very much the way I worked. I've hardly ever done a setup shot once. It just has to do with the fact that in spaces like the ones I've been shooting typically, I was shooting a lot of Gothic cathedrals early on, a lot of churches, a lot of fantastic architectural spaces. They have openings, and light is going to be coming in those openings in different ways throughout the day. So I think if you go into the building with the idea that you don't have a particular shot you want to get ahead of time, I think that's the important thing. So if there's any philosophy behind it, it is allowing what the building is telling you to dictate how you're shooting the shot. You see what I'm saying?
It's remarkable. It's like in the exercise of meditation, because what one has to learn when one wants to meditate and meditate authentically is to silence the senses, our 5 senses, so that you can create an emptiness. And once the emptiness is created, then you're visited upon by thought.
Yeah, it could be. I wonder how the senses play into this. One way of looking at it is a sort of silencing. Another way we could think about it, or the way I've thought about it, is that I'm actually, in a strange way, more aware. You know, in a meditative state, you become more aware of what your senses are telling you, but you're not necessarily distracted by them, right?
Okay. As a matter of fact, I think we've just begun looking at some of the pictures, and it's remarkable, just accidentally, the first picture that we're going to talk about, which is quite famous on Haviland Street. Students have commented on it extensively, is this particular picture. Both the frame and the picture are striking. I have asked you this question before. I had asked you if you did the frame, and you said you did.
Yes.
So we might want to talk about this.
Yeah.
Here it is.
Maybe that previous image?
The previous image, if we can. Yes.
Yeah.
I hope it's going to come back to us.
One.
There it is.
There it is. So yes, that image I shot in the Oude Kerk. It's right in the center of the red light district of Amsterdam. And it's, among other things, you see there's this fantastic spiral stair that's part of the image. And we see doorways that are kind of opening onto that. And a lot of images in this series feature, it's just the way the building is set up. These doors are sort of thrown open in these very evocative ways, and I happen to be attracted to that. And again, something about the space I shot, that is on the south side of the building, so it was getting a lot of natural light, and I just gravitated there in a way. But as far as the image within that frame, or I actually call it an environment, right? It's not exactly a frame, but rather an environment that it lives in. It's funny, I ended up taking parts of my apartment apart to build it. I had those curtains hanging in my space at one point. The wood was composing a wall that made one of the walls in my apartment.
I see.
I actually took part of the wall down. I took the curtains down. There was a support, the part that is beneath, that was on one of my walls. I took it down, and I started. It's strange. All of these cues that are just in the space you live in, that are around you, they can all become part of the work of art. But one of the things I was aiming for, I suppose, or thinking about with that, is that photographs are, physically speaking, a two-dimensional surface that show three-dimensional space in some way. That's one way a photograph can be understood. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to find a way to let this photograph start to reach out physically into the space of the viewer somehow? And so with the doors that are on this, almost like an altarpiece, you know, the doors I put on it that actually have hinges and it moves, it can open and close. And with the curtains, I was actually picking up on motifs not only in that image, like the doors being thrown open, but also the curtains. That comes up in another one of the images from the series, where it's a very typically Dutch kind of way to handle the rooms, where you have a curtain slung over in that particular fashion. So what it was doing, it was kind of bringing the whole, I don't know, life world of those pictures out into the space of the viewer somehow.
The colors also seem to be deliberately chosen. The dark green, the black, and then the shades of light and dark blue inside, environing the object, seem to fit into some kind of aesthetic structure.
Yeah, that's it. The curtains, certainly, it was strange. They just happened to be that color, but I think I was considering green. When I was in Amsterdam, I was seeing a lot of green and red, and it was just making an impact on me generally, that a lot of shutters on windows are red, or a lot of doors are red, or they're a dark green color. So green and red were on my mind. And actually the frame, I looked into Dutch sort of frame finishing techniques back from the 17th century, and they would use a lacquer that mixed black with ruby red. And so what I did, I mixed a little red pigment into the paint, and I just experimented with lacquers until I got something that caught the light in a nice way. And I put on several layers and sort of looked into the processes of how they made these frames. And it just ended up being very rich. I don't think anyone has to know that necessarily. I don't trouble myself with telling anyone about that in the exhibit.
Of course not.
But that's sort of how I came about it in a way.
How many drafts do you do of this entire culture to produce it?
Oh, the actual part of the frame that I mentioned? Yeah, you know, this might be something where you finish each piece of wood, then you have to sand it down, you finish it again, you sand it down again, maybe 5 times. You go through this process several times, and it tends to build up a rich, multi-layered luster. You could do it probably up to 10 times if you wanted to.
I see. My impression is that you're a perfectionist. You don't get easily satisfied with your work.
It's that frame, building that frame was one of those efforts where I realized I had caught myself in the midst of, okay, I'm in this, I've committed myself to it, and I was building it right to the last second.
Let's roll back to the picture with the stairs first, and then we'll return to this picture. Pictures, please. There we go. And what are we doing here?
Sorry?
What are we doing?
In this picture?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is the one that was in the frame. Now we're seeing it without the frame.
Without the frame. This was inside the environment, as you call it.
Yeah, so this is just the picture sort of on its own.
On its own.
Yeah. And again, it's something that, you know, if you want to go back to that for just a sec, the invitation for that frame was very specific in a way. If you look at the right edge of the image, and you can see it a little better here because it's closer up maybe.
Yes.
The left side of the image, you can see a door jamb in there. There's a little bit of
That's
woodwork, right? So the left and the right sides of the image both have the presence of the doors themselves, and they coincide with the physical edges of the image. And I just found that intriguing because what that means is that you've cropped that in some way. So again, the invitation was to extend it somehow. Right?
I see.
Yeah.
So in this instance, for example, correct me if I'm wrong, what you're featuring are two talents that you have. Your interest in architecture and your interest in photography. You're combining both. So this is a special kind of photography. It's not something that any photographer could do. Because you have studied space architecturally.
Right. My training in architecture, even though it was fairly short-lived, it was pretty intense. The Cornell Architecture School was a wonderful crash course in ways of exploring space.
I see.
There was actually a huge influence of Le Corbusier's architecture in the teaching and in the whole culture at the school. And one of the things that Le Corbusier talked about a lot was this idea of the promenade, moving through space with your body.
I see.
That somehow the phenomenological engagement, right, the bodily engagement of me with the space and movement and time matter somehow. So again, maybe this reaching out that I was suggesting with the frame, it's all in that mix of thinking of art as a very multidimensional experience.
I see, I see. Could we go back to that picture with the yellow background, please? Picture space. Here we go. The yellow reminds me of Van Gogh. Could you describe this setting a little bit for us?
Yeah. It's really fascinating that you say that because there were so many things about this particular space that reminded me of paintings I had seen. I thought particularly with some of them of Vermeer's paintings. Maybe it has to do with the way these cloths are draped and the way that floors are set up. Not in this particular image necessarily, but there's a way that these Dutch interiors were structured, and sometimes they appear in 17th century paintings, and this is an older space.
I see.
So sometimes you get these hints, and you almost see, oh, a painter might have gotten some ideas from spaces like
That's
this.
right.
Yeah?
This hardly looks like a picture to me. It looks like a painting. For example, the yellow that takes me in visually to the interiors of Van Gogh's bedroom, because the chair in the bedroom, if memory serves me well, are deeply yellow. Here's more. And here, how did you manage to take the reader deep inside these different rooms, different walls? This is what I mean by making darkness beautiful.
Yeah, this was from a series I did previous to the Amsterdam series. Maybe 3 years ago, I shot this as part of a series, and we hung it at Berkeley as well. And here, there was an industrial space not far from where I live, and I just happened to be walking around there one day. And I said, oh, this is an interesting space. Maybe I'll have to come back with my camera one time. And then I came back and just started taking shots. And these are all from different spaces. Some of this is from yet another space, this particular image, but again, kind of an industrial space. But I was just starting to get fascinated with wall surfaces at the time. And yeah, the darkness, I don't know, I was also doing, previous to that, I had been doing some shots on theatrical sets.
I see.
And I got interested in, and I'd been doing some acting myself and some set design also. And so I became interested in theatrical lighting, and somehow I was just noticing things. Again, this is a continuation of things I was looking at before, but I became specifically interested in how some moments that you come upon feel like they're lit in this almost surreal way. I also think, I was very taken with a lot of the films of David Lynch, and I think that the way he uses light is incredibly captivating.
I also curiously noticed that in none of the photographs that I have seen thus far are human beings directly present.
That's right.
Why that?
Yeah, that's...
You're not interested in the human body?
Oh, no, since
or
this
at least
time...
the viewer viewing something, for example, something that I could easily imagine you to do phenomenologically. You'll have the picture of a viewer who is looking into an industrial space, since you can photograph both simultaneously. But I guess that does not interest you.
Well, since that time, I think my shooting has changed, where I've started to actually, beginning on the Amsterdam trip, and since that time I've begun to shoot video as well, because I felt like that would be a natural extension of photography. In fact, some of those pictures that we're seeing, like the one with the yellow wall, that was a still from a video.
From a video?
Yeah, and I was specifically interested in finding ways to have photography speak a more musical language, if you see what I'm saying. And so one way to do that is to have the image occur through time. Right? So you have music that requires time in order to unfold, and I thought, well, what about an image in time? And then you have something like film and video at that point. So tip me off to what you just asked me once more. I kind of lost, you were mentioning...
About the possibility of photographing a viewer,
with
any
people,
viewer.
With people, okay,
with
sorry,
people.
yeah, I got a little sidetracked there.
People
so one,
inside space, or looking at space, or as part of space.
So here's the thing, that when I was studying architecture and when I was documenting that thesis I was talking about, I was often going through pains to not have anyone in the image. I mean, if they were in the image, fine, but I didn't necessarily need that, to have a person in the image. And it just seemed that what I was captivated by was the space itself. It didn't seem to particularly demand. There was nothing in me that said, I must have a human subject in this. But once in a while, I would either put myself in the picture or someone would be in the picture, and I would like those pictures too. They were interesting to me. They offered an element of scale or something. But it wasn't until I started shooting video in Amsterdam that I became truly interested in having human presence literally in pictures. Because as I was reviewing the video footage, often I thought, oh, I just want to get a video of this space. And there were images where I was just filming the space, and sometimes those were wonderful, and those are things that I kept. But other times, someone would come into the frame, and it was fascinating. And maybe particularly because it was video, sometimes one person would come in or a couple would drift in.
Yes.
And you would see how they would interact and how they would behave in the space, and it was very revealing somehow. I thought, wow, it feels so intimate. These people don't know, I didn't try to film them, and they don't know I'm filming them. So from that point on, I became very interested in the human presence. But I have to say that earlier on, with the question of human presence, I felt like what happens with a lot of people when they look at a picture is that they become very absorbed in the human form in the picture. And I wasn't really trying not to put people in, but I think my natural inclination was, no, like we said before, space itself is the subject. Space is the actor, not just space, but light. And I think light particularly is what activates and makes magical all of this, right? It kind of brings it together in some way.
To be honest with you, this is extending your project perhaps a bit too far. But once I began studying your work, I couldn't help but imagine you photographing something or the other in places like San Juan, Barbados, or Antigua. These are places that I have been to, which captivated me at night, because you're so good with light, with darkness, that if you were to combine that interest with people doing things at these places at night, I think you produce some enormous kind of work. Would this interest you, do you think? Or would this, is this outside of your analytically focused interest in space, in what you call space, without human presence?
I don't even think of it necessarily as a particular idea that I'm wed to in any way. You know, I just think of it as a matter of fact. That's what I was interested in, and so that's what I did. But yes, in fact, recently, I guess the thoughts that have come to my mind, for some reason, maybe it was flying over to Amsterdam a couple times, and I happened to fly on Iceland Air, and so I saw these pictures of Iceland and the natural scenery. started to captivate me in some way. Because as you said, a lot of my pictures focus on interiors.
Yes.
So just to be in the natural landscape, that's one element of what you're talking about. And then whether or not a human presence comes into it, that's another question.
That's right. I couldn't help but imagine you in this particular old pebbled streets of old San Juan, narrow streets, the closest aesthetic resemblance that I could think of is certain interiors of North End in Boston, for example.
Right.
At night,
Right.
amazing spaces that I have seen there. And by then I had already seen some of your work. I have thought through it. I was in San Juan about 6 months ago, and I truly and honestly thought about you in these spaces.
Okay, yeah.
Photographing interesting streets,
Yeah.
unbelievably interesting streets,
Yeah.
and the islanders in them. This is the value of the South.
Yeah, I haven't been to any of these places, so it's an interesting thought altogether.
The same is true about Barbados, that I have seen also. Again, at night. They are fascinating during daylight, but they are much more fascinating at night. This is what I thought.
Yeah. Well, this is something that...
Like what Baudelaire used to do, according to Walter Benjamin, with the arcade projects, visiting cities at night.
Yeah. Did a little bit of night exploring on that last trip to Amsterdam, and mostly filming at night. And some of the shots that you had referred to where there's this sort of darkness, a lot of people asked me if they were shot at night or not. Only one of them happened to be shot at night, which was
I didn't think they were shot at night. You just shot darkness.
Right.
But then the natural setting of darkness will be a contributing factor to what you have already mastered.
Yeah, and
it will naturalize it.
I'm fascinated also by, again, if you have a human presence in the pictures, that always changes the way that you're shooting.
Yes.
So again, that's an even more intensified version of finding something, in the sense that it's a very active, in the split second, right?
Precisely. I also thought this is somehow rendering it frivolous, perhaps not. I also imagined students who visit your work on 7 Haviland Street, capturing them without their awareness while they are viewing your work.
Yeah, exactly.
Would be something to consider, at least one, just experimentally, and see what happens to space in the eyes of the viewer who, to use your term, is absorbed with it, to capture the human body in movement.
Yeah. And that's interesting because that can lead to a whole project in itself, right?
I think so.
Documenting what's happening with the works on the wall.
Precisely. It gives your work a fluidity, a continuity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I don't know if I've ever done anything like that with my projects so far, but I'm really interested in sort of artistic, this is a lot of modern and contemporary art that started to trace those trajectories, right? Of making, or somehow enlivening or being aware of what's happening in the phenomenal experience of the viewer in relation to the work of art. Right?
To take you to a terrain that you may not be willing to go to, I'm almost sure that you're familiar with Walter Benjamin and his interest in photography.
Oh yeah. I mean, I guess the seminal essay, and one that everybody reads, especially in art history, is The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproducibility and Mechanical Reproduction.
Reproduction, yes.
Yeah.
And now, while I was doing some research on your work, I was intrigued by this idea of perspective. Perspective of perspectives is how one of your admirers, one of your commentators on your work put the meaning of your project. Would you like to break that down for us?
Yeah, I mean, actually that comes from a paper I wrote maybe about 10 years ago, and I called it Perspective Before Perspective, and I called it The Spaces of Medieval Architecture. That was sort of the subtitle of it, and it ended up being a work that I was writing while I was doing my doctoral studies at Columbia, where I was talking about medieval church spaces, and how, I mean, the simple version of it is medieval architecture, in the way that it's set up on the interior with the supports, the piers and the columns on the interior, and also with the doorways on the exterior. And they have this particular repetitive arched, almost funneled shape. I was talking about those doorways and the interiors as a form of perspective in the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, before perspective was developed in the Renaissance as a painterly technique, because that's the famous moment, the moment of Brunelleschi and Alberti in the 15th century Renaissance in Italy, right, in Florence. We speak of that as a discovery or an invention of perspective, right? But actually, what I was sort of tracing with this project is that everything that they were doing geometrically was presupposed in the geometric setup of medieval church spaces.
I see.
And part of it is a little bit difficult to describe on the interior, but on the exterior it's very easy, that the doorways themselves just look like perspectives of the interior of the space. So you have a doorway on the outside that has several arches that repeat, but they keep getting smaller.
I see.
So it's as if you're funneling the viewer into the space. The door splays are on a diagonal. If you were to see it above from a bird's eye view, they're diagonally placed. And what that does, it creates a kind of funneling effect, and there are jam figures along the doorways, but it feels like a repetitive sequence of piers and arches, and then when you walk in the building, that's what you see. You see a repetitive sequence of piers and arches. But all it's doing, it's taking that image of the interior that is actual three-dimensional space, fully extended, and now it's compressing it into a space of, I don't know, 10, 12, 15, 20 feet thick maybe at the doorway. Right?
And that's what you see.
Yeah, and so what happens is you have that, that image of the interior before you've entered.
Incredible. And you call that perspective before perspective.
Yeah, and then what happens on the inside, again, I would almost need an image to demonstrate it, but the simple description of it is that when you walk in the space, there are certain positions that you stand in, there are certain coincidences that happen between you, your body, and the columns, and the way they align, and the way that solids and voids align in the building. The only thing I can compare it to is like if you've ever driven in a car and you go by a field where they've planted rows of corn, or a vineyard or something, and you see at certain points everything lines up.
Yes.
Right? It keeps lining up. And what you feel from that is almost musical. It's like a rhythm that develops, and it's because you're moving through the space, but you're creating the alignments by your bodily movement. And that happens in these spaces in a way that actually looks a lot like, if you sort of go in the space and diagram it out, it actually looks a lot like the perspective diagrams that the people who invented perspective were talking about. It goes back to Euclidean geometry quite simply, but your body is now making that situation as you walk through the space.
Okay.
Yeah.
And now I can't help, and at the expense of sounding too pretentious, and I'm not, I'm making every effort to understand your project in the best way I can. I would like us to talk about the relationship between music and photography, as you just did. But I want you to delve deeper into that.
Music and photography. Well, where could we begin, huh? There's so much you can talk about. I guess it's almost hard to know where to start, right? Music and photography. Well, yeah. I'm thinking about this.
Please,
yeah.
I don't mean to throw a trick question.
No, it's not a trick question. It's just
it by saying,
there's so many ways I could go into. I mean, something that comes.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, something that comes to mind. I guess there's a very sort of hands-on, practical end to it that I'm thinking about these days, and that's quite simply with some of these images I've taken. I've been thinking about, well, how would I actually compose music for those images in some way, right? And it gets into the video part of it as well, that those are moving images, but it's just an extension of a photographic image. So, or to lend, one way of looking at photography as an art form is to say that it sort of takes a cross-section of time. It captures or freezes a moment in time.
Okay.
And some photographs feel like they really freeze a moment, like that's just a moment, an instant. But some have the implication of maybe moments around it. There's almost the implication of extension. So that's a whole sort of topic of conversation in itself, but I guess what I'm thinking about from
We'll do it one day when you come back.
yeah, from a
We can
practical
do a
standpoint,
full
it has
show
to
on
do
that.
with, say, if I'm composing a piece of music, I'm just looking for, it's strange, there's nothing particularly theoretical about it, but I'm just looking for something that evokes a feeling maybe in an image that I've done. And so from time to time these days I've been sitting down at the piano with an image and maybe starting to pick out certain sounds that seem to make sense in relation to those images. And this is a lot of what I do in my teaching at Berkeley, so
That's what I thought.
It's
Yes.
feeding in, from a lot of that influence in a way. So that's something that I'm absolutely fascinated with.
You're also interested in Egyptian art. Your interest is so varied. Unless I'm mistaken, I was looking at some of the courses that you're teaching for us. And I think you're offering a course, or you have offered a course, or you may be planning to offer a course on Egyptian art.
Yes, I taught at least one course, but maybe more than one at Berkeley on Egyptian art when I first came in. And it's strange, but in graduate school I just happened to be chosen to be a teaching assistant for an Egyptian art course.
I see.
And I had a great interest in it anyhow. But in terms of some of the work I was doing at the time, I was genuinely interested because those temples, the Egyptian temples, when you think of Karnak and such, and of course the pyramids, right, of Giza and so on, those buildings fascinated me from the large-scale historical perspective of the way that architecture had evolved over the long course of time. I started with a study of medieval architecture, but the things I was finding that I can only allude to briefly here when I was talking about these geometries and so on, I then immediately went to Greek architecture, and then I went to Renaissance architecture and modern architecture, but I went back to Mesopotamian architecture and then to Egyptian architecture just to see, is something similar happening in those spaces, or is it something different than the medieval?
What did you find out?
Yeah, and in fact I found that even though there are generic similarities between, say, the temple at Karnak and, say, Chartres Cathedral, if we're to compare an Egyptian temple to, say, a Gothic cathedral, even though there are many similarities, there's lots of columns inside the space, there's a central avenue that you walk down, there are significant differences as well, and it has to do with the way that windows and openings, and it's a lot of this stuff that I was talking about where these alignments occur in a space.
I see.
But the overall feeling was that in these Egyptian temples, they're fairly closed in on themselves. A Greek temple is fairly closed in on itself. In other words, there's light coming in, but it's often coming in through a clear story, kind of up above, and it's not a very bright light in an Egyptian temple. Whereas in Gothic cathedrals and in early Christian churches, there are windows that are punctured into the wall surfaces. There are openings, and that affords the interior. It floods the interior with light, especially in the Gothic period. So part of what I was looking at, both in Egyptian and in Greek architecture, was the way that they were sort of enclosed. And I was relating that a little bit to the evolution of space, the way that space itself had been thought of philosophically and scientifically over the course of many centuries. And so immediately, my point of reference for a lot of that material, the Egyptian material that you asked about, but also the Greek material, because there's a similarity between them in the sense that they're rather enclosed on themselves. This medieval architecture made a break. It punctured the wall. It opened something in a fundamental way that is different. And it's not just that, but that's an important part of what happened during that time that starts to differ from these earlier styles. And I was intrigued to read Aristotle, who talked about the universe, and he said the whole universe is contained within a shell. You know, he says it's the stars, the fixed stars, they're rotating around us, we're at the center in the earth, and the stars are rotating around us, and outside of that there's absolutely nothing. Neither space nor time nor void, he says, outside of the cosmos. It's just like a nutshell that's around the universe. There's no holes or openings in it. And so I thought, a Greek temple. The inside of that building is formed in such a way without windows. And you have the statue of Athena, maybe in the Parthenon, but when you're in it, it's enclosed from the outside world in a way. The Egyptian temple is rather similar in that regard, but then you get a pretty radical shift when you get especially into the period that I was studying, medieval architecture. The 11th century in particular is where it really happens, because you don't only have window openings through the walls, but these great flying buttresses that were developed in the Romanesque, but really into the Gothic period. They cut through the wall surface in such a way as to create continuity between the inside and the outside of the building structurally. The structural system on the inside cuts through and becomes visible on the outside. It's like your bones and the way they show through your flesh, right? So that became an important moment to show how space itself, in the built sense, in the practical sense of how a designer would design a space, there was a shift in conception of space where it started to break open. And I noticed that, just with a little bit of study, you see very quickly that our own view of the universe, at least in our Western understanding of it, the way it changed over time, took on a very similar pattern. We went from a closed to an open universe. And so the buildings, and I was interested in the way that the architecture could start to comment on that or reflect the philosophical and the scientific discussion in some way, if you see what I'm saying.
So the idea of the universe as a nutshell on your reading is an Egyptian idea then that Aristotle honed further.
Well, I don't know exactly where he was picking.
He was schooled in Egypt.
Exactly. So where he's picking that up from is a question. But yes, that's in concept. You could say that the Greek temple and a lot of these Greek figures, the Kiros figures of early Greek sculpture, right? They're picking directly up from Egyptian sculpture.
That's what their scholars were contending, that what we have come to know, most particularly in the fields of philosophy, astronomy, geometry, and mathematics is what we learned from ancient Egyptian priests. Aristotle says so. I think Plato also says so. Quite a few Greek philosophers, in contrast to the Greek masses who did not know any of this, openly admit that their conception of the universe, their metaphysical understanding of the self, the portrait of the philosopher as the thinker, first originated among the philosophical practices of Egyptian priests who schooled them. This is not to deny, of course, to be stupid to deny originality to the Greeks and to those who came after them. But the initial impulse, the breeding ground, it seems to be ancient Egypt.
Yeah, and that comes.
Am I right?
That comes as no surprise in a way. Again, if you look at the architectural and the artistic sort of borrowings or the carryovers from Egypt into ancient Greece, you can see this. I think a fascinating twist to the whole story, if I may add, is that Aristotle represents one small, highly significant, as you know, but small corner of Greek thought at that time and from before his time. For example, a lot of what he was doing in his writings, and you know this very well, is he was critiquing the atomists and other views, right?
Yes.
Of the way that the cosmos was composed. And in fact, his view, it was just one of many. He happened to say it's closed, and it's so interesting that it became the dominant view, right?
Yes.
Because actually a lot of philosophers and thinkers were not saying that. They were talking about something much more unlimited, something much more what we would consider modern, I guess. And Carl Sagan even makes a point of it. That old series that he did back in, I think, the 70s, Cosmos, he talks about the incredible influence of Aristotle right up through the Renaissance in Western culture. And he talks about the way that the life world that Aristotle came from was one of great privilege, right? The whole politics of Aristotle's world was one in which, if you want to think of it in terms that we're describing, it's sort of like you have the earth at the center. It's a very egocentric view of the universe. And what you're doing, in a way, you put the shell and everything is stable and all of the elements layer themselves in a logical way. And there's a natural order to things.
Precisely.
Right? And so what you're able to do is, in a sense, what he's doing is giving an image of the status quo in a way.
Exactly.
Right? And it took a long, long time until Western culture, through its own, you think of the development of devices like the telescope, where you could not have the phenomena match those observations anymore, then something had to change at a certain point.
You're quite right. You're quite right. We have about 4 minutes left, and I would like you to use this 4 minutes in any way you want. We have a huge audience that is viewing us, and your photographs are so mesmerizing. I'm sure my audience is glued to these works, so you might want to to say something or the other that you think your viewers should pay attention to when they view your works in the future? What should they pay attention to? What should they learn from them? And how should they learn from them? Take this opportunity to give us a sort of a study guide of your visual culture.
Yeah. Well, I think the beautiful thing about photographs or any work of art, if you really think of it, is that I took those pictures and maybe there was something going on at that moment, and when I was printing them, there was a very intensive process of making sure everything is just so. But I rather enjoy that experience of just letting them go into the world, right? And then, like you said, people are in a space and they all have different ways of interacting with these works. They all have different ways of experiencing them. And I just get really curious about the way that people read the works or understand them. And usually I'm learning an awful lot from that. I never really ask anyone, but sometimes people have taken me, and you once took me to one of my pictures and began describing things to me.
Yes.
So all I can say...
I was testing my understanding on you,
yeah,
so that I won't distort the intentionality.
Oh, again, rather than saying that there might be something required on the part of the audience, I would rather say I feel like I continue to learn as I engage people who have seen them. Our other colleagues, Beth, George Eastman made an incredible comment about color in one of my images, and it stuck with me so much.
George is a brilliant man.
Yeah, it was just the most insightful comment, and it was this one image that just had a little more color than the rest, and it just got me thinking about that in an entirely different way.
Quite right, yes. Just like the yellow on that wall just stood with me.
Yeah.
I'll be carrying it with me for a long time. Yeah. Well, this has been a remarkable show for me and for Afghan Ascent with Anthony Shibelia, my colleague, my friend, and now my teacher from Berklee College of Music. Thank you so much for coming to Afghan Ascent. We have about a few seconds left, I think, and you can use it in any way you want.
Thank you for having me.